Good morning everyone and most welcome to 1334 of the Heidegger series. I will continue with the article of Terry and it will be a link in the description. Fractal entanglement between observer and observed. And I am presently at page 10. With fractals, sticking to quantitative measurement only leads to paradox, precisely because the smaller our measuring device, the longer the measurement. At the limit of an infinitely small device, we will obtain an infinitely large measurement. This led Mandelbrot's 1977 to his famous conclusion that the length of any stretch of coastline is infinitely long. As often happens in science, paradox is adverted through new discovery. In this case, expanding the traditional notion of dimensionality. Into the fractional, embodies paradox as it redefines new relations between observers and the observed. The observer in the observed. In the characterization of organizational closure, nothing prevents the observer himself from being part of the process of specifying the system. Not only by describing it, but by being one link in the network of process that defines the system. Francisco Varela, whether existing abstractly in the phase space underneath chaos, in physical or material form, or psychologically. Fractals implicate the observer in the observed. This is apparent in the notion of fractal separatrices. Where inside and outside, self and other, spirit and matter are paradoxically separated through fractal boundaries, yet hopelessly entwined. In the previous section, we also saw how the observer lies hidden in the observed, as built right into the very concept of fractal dimensionality. This gives us a clue about reflexivity even at the most primitive levels of macroscopic existence. On every level, recursive cycles of re-entry seem to etch temporal dynamics into special form. Varela suggested that self-reference is the hinge upon which levels of serial inclusiveness intercross. it appears as if different, successively larger levels are connected and intercross at the point where the constituents of the new lower level refer to themselves. Where antinomic, that is contradictory, forms appear and time sets in. We recognize this fact in ordinary speech. When trying to convey a description of a new domain, we often construct an apparent antinomy to induce the listener's cognition in a way such as to compel his imagination towards the construction of a larger domain where the apparent opposites can exist in unity. A moral example. Once you lose everything, you have everything. Or a philosophical one. A being is when it ceases to be. It is easy to view the universe in terms of successively larger levels of serial inclusiveness. Connect and intercross. As a crude example, physics is embedded within chemistry, which is embedded within biology. which is embedded within psychology. Grimmar and St. Denis have pioneered the use of fractal geometry to envision formal systems, including the representation of paradox and incompleteness. I propose fractal dynamics to be one way of conceptualizing how Varela's levels of serial inclusiveness connect and intercross. Where the comprising attractors beneath chaotic forces in nature. Including human nature, whether existing in physical or symbolic form. Fractals negotiate the boundary zone. The place where levels contain the antinomy of opposites, both unified and separated. Because fractals span all levels, separating and connecting them at boundary points. These dynamics might help to bridge traditional levels of analysis. from the purely physical level of pregorgines, far from equilibrium thermodynamics. Through biological levels of re-entry in Maturana and Varela's autopoietic systems. To the higher order social and cultural levels implied by Peirce's concept of historical drift and praxis. The irony is this: while we may use unnatural or mechanical means, such as computers, to discover and illuminate the workings of fractals, what we illuminate extends beyond and beneath the postmodern mirrors that reflect infinite regression in forms of human production and reproduction. By illuminating fractals, we self-reflexively illuminate the observer in the observed, in nothing short of nature herself. It's very aptly put, I have to say, almost quotable. I will repeat it. By illuminating fractals, we self-reflexively illuminate the observer in the observed, in nothing short of nature herself. This insight dovetails with a frequent religious vision of all creation as self-reflexive expression of self into form to know. Share and lovingly reunite with self. It also dovetails with the position of neurological positivism espoused by philosopher and psychologist Larry Vanderwert. Vanderwert claims that evolution itself proceeds self-reflexively. Culminating in the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain. As we use our brains self-reflexively to examine ourselves, our models grow more sophisticated and ever closer to the fractal stuff of which our minds, brains, and nature at large is composed. Conclusion. With fractals as a new metaphor of mind, we no longer need to deify or defile mechanism as metaphor. Instead, we can use mechanism as a tool. As we continue to use the recursive formulas of chaos, complexity, fractal geometry, and cellular automata to simulate the natural world. We see across multiple nested levels of serial inclusiveness. That self-similar fractal dynamics recur as a meta-pattern. Cycles of re-entry continually oscillate between creating and erasing the seam where observer and observed perceiver and perceived, inner and outer, self and other, intersect and self-cross paradoxically. At this seam, the self and world appear mutually co-determining. This is where the act of making a distinction creates the world as we perceive it, and where the world brings distinction to the consciousness of the perceiver. This is rather amazing. I will just make a short reflection and then read another text and see how they intermingle. But I need to say here, it is rather incredible that mechanism can stay as a tool. And as she wrote so eloquently, we no longer need to deify, but neither defile mechanism as metaphor. That is in itself an incredible boon. But more about that later. Could you possibly, Kalle, put a pause? I will continue, and I see parallels in different areas. And I will try to, in this lecture and in the following, make comparisons and then have a questionnaire discussion. One text here and one line of thinking I see connection to is, as I think some of you already figured out, it's perceptual performance and perceptual affordance. They are very close to the mechanism as described by Terry. The second is Heidegger and anxiety, and that will come from the text Thinking, Language, Bounding World. And we even have almost the same term, intertwined, says Terry, and here we have the bounding. I start with the Gibsonian approach, and I will continue to read a paper started at 1326. General ecological information for affordances as relations. These two approaches have begun to converge, most relevantly in Breuneberg, Chemero, and Rietveld. They propose a framework for how to perceive these kinds of relations, which would make them viable candidate affordances. The framework is general ecological information, which they define like this. General ecological information is any regularity in the ecological niche between aspects of the environment X and Y, such that the occurrence of aspect X makes the occurrence of aspect Y likely. Because of the regular relation between the aspects of the material X and Y, general ecological information allows an animal to couple to a distal, that is not sensorily present aspect of the socio-material environment. General ecological information pertains to the ways in which aspects of the environment tend to occur together. Like smoke and fire, an object and a shadow, or a pub and a beer. End of quote. Lawful ecological information as the kinematic specification of dynamics is then claimed to be a special case of this more general notion, in which the relevant regularity is a specification relation between a dynamical property of the environment and a kinematic property of an energy array. Bruineberg et al. Simply propose that any sufficiently regular relation between environmental properties can serve as information. In the sense that regularities that hold between aspects of the environment allow animals to be informed about one aspect of the environment by the presence of another aspect. One kind of simple example that comes up is the relation between the human form of life and the presence of beer in fridges, or between beer labels and the presence of beer in the can. When the fridge or the can are closed, I cannot perceive the beer via law-based ecological information described above. But when I want a beer, I am able to go searching in good locations. I am successfully organizing my behavior with respect to wanting beer, but without direct access to the location of that beer. The question at hand is, how can we use the presence of a fridge or a beer can to perceive the presence of beer when the beer is out of view, without representing the presence of beer. I think it could be apt here to compare that to a hidden thing in a box. It could be a beetle, it could be a cat. End of my comment. Fridges, beer cans and beer are sufficiently regularly related because of human socio-cultural practices. The presence of a beer can or fridge can therefore be informative. About the presence of beer. We might be wrong. We might not have gone shopping yet, or there may have been a mix-up at the beer plant, resulting in beer cans full of water. But the constraint created by the socio-cultural relation between fridges, beer cans and beer makes the former two informative about the presence of the latter. And the possibility of malfunction is considered a feature, not a bug. The constraint is general ecological information for the relation, and to an ecological psychologist, the thing you perceive is an affordance. Affordances are therefore relations. General ecological information is not perceptual information. I now have all the pieces I need to lay out the argument that, unlike lawful ecological information, general ecological information is not perceptual information, and that we therefore cannot perceive affordances as relations. I noted above that almost all of the behaviorally relevant environment is over there. That is not in direct mechanical contact with us. There is a literal gap between any organism and the things it needs to know about. This literal gap must be filled in order for an organism to be in perceptual contact with that environment. In addition, a specific issue for ecological psychologists is that in order for perception to be direct, that literal gap must be filled in a particular way. Direct perception is formally a two-term relation that includes the organism and the environment, with nothing mediating that contact. Any theory of affordances must therefore come with a theory of information that allows it to function as perceptual information for the direct perception of those affordances. Lawful ecological information for affordances as dispositions, fills that gap by being implemented in a perceptual medium that is ambient to both the environment and the organism. It fills it in a manner that supports direct perception via lawful specification. Specification is an impredictive entailment. Impredictive entailments are closed loops. Specification is a particular kind of impredictive entailment. The presence of a dynamical property entails the presence of a lawful ecological information variable. And the presence of that variable entails the presence of that property. Specifying information can therefore implement the two-term organism-environment relation without acting as a mediator, and can therefore support direct perception. This should be compared to the readout of the fractality, where the fractality itself is doing the readout. General ecological information, however, cannot even fill the gap, let alone implement the direct perception of affordances as relations. The constraint that is being informative lives between two aspects of the environment over there, and not between an aspect of the environment and the organism. You see, this text, my comment, is mirroring Terry exactly. It's not over there, and it's not solely in the organism. The constraint is not ambient to the observer and the environment. Take the beer can example. what makes the presence of the beer can informative about the presence of beer is the socio-cultural constraint that humans put beer in beer cans. That constraint exists between beer and beer cans, and nota bene, not between beer cans and an observer. While the constraint is perfectly real, it cannot place the organism in perceptual contact with the beer. This is true of any constraints allowed in the definition of general ecological information that do anything more than what ecological information already does. The net result is that these relational constraints cannot serve as perceptual information, so the relations cannot be objects of perception. So these relations are not affordances. This should be compared to, if this is an observer and this is the beer can, the old model says the observer reads off the beer can and sort of perceive/understand it. Here is pointing to a lot of the things are already present in the beer can, so to speak, in the environment. We humans fill cans with beer. There is an incredibly complex net of factories, relations, recipes, memories of seeing beer cans, touching them, and all of a sudden we come to understand that the interconnectedness is incredibly much more important. And this is, of course, spoiler alert, zu handeln also, but I will get into that later. But this is showing almost to the word what Terry is showing, that it is in the fractality, not a distant readout where the two things are completely isolated. The observer comes in and, oh, I just perceive the beer can with all its information, Geschichte, history, connections and understanding. So all knowledge then becomes on the observer side. I'll take some questions here, if there are any, and then a short break.
Excellent. comparisons can be applied. There is observation to the beer can, that is the smaller measuring device. So in this case, what would be is it our eyes that are the measuring device, or what is when we see the beer can? Or what do you say? Perhaps it's the eye. It's very small. Our eyes are very small in comparison with the beer can.
Well, the good thing here, the eyes are certainly one thing, without a doubt. But the eyes are in Terry's / Affordances and Heidegger a lot more than we give them credit for. They are the whole background, the whole net of interactions that stretches infinitely to the sides. Experience already in childhood, in the nation, in the society of beer cans, and I would say a lot of fractal subconscious understanding that we cannot even point to. And yes, as you said, Kalle, the mechanism, and this is what Terry said, my hair went up. The mechanism is still there. It is not reduced. It's rather expanded. The eyes, and why not the hand as well, grabbing the beer can if we want to make it even more complex. While the old model, sorry Hume, doesn't really hold. Here comes a blank observer, and all the information is either in the beer can or in the observer. It doesn't really hold, and it doesn't even give credit to the mechanism.
No, I could spin on this. So I as a measuring device. So if you take the beer can, the closer you put it towards your eye, more information you get. That's a little bit the idea from fractality. The less information you get, you farther away you put the beer can.
Yes. Very good, Kalle. The closer you get, and that could be seen in this expanded perspective, maybe you get closer. And this, I don't mention this metaphorically. I still talk about the eyes and the touch, but you realize more when you get closer. More memories, first beer sip, that beer in Yugoslavia in 1985, that there were no foam, no carbon dioxide. I remember that now. That is getting closer to it. It is making it more complex and deep. But I can also retract, and if I go back enough, it will almost I say, be 400. Almost.
Excellent, Hans. I have, since at least 2 years back, I have wondered why you talk so much about affordances. But now, in January 5th, I get the point, so to say. Very good answer, very well. To you and Terry, of course, and the article.
Just a pause there, because I will continue a little. I will continue here with the rest of J.J. Gibson, and then I will continue to make a parallel to Heidegger. And Terry is acting as a catalyzer here for opening up understanding in many different areas. And I have to add, she actually solves a problem of didactics, and that is to explain why observer and observed are both separable and intertwined. as Terry calls it, or Gibson says that they are intermingled or in relational knowledge contact with each other. Information is relational, so affordances do not have to be. I mentioned above that the challenges to affordances as dispositions are real and that they do require a relational solution. The required relational work is actually done at the scale of lawful ecological information. Specifically in the relational act of perception and action. In which we use lawful ecological information to organize our behavior. The purpose of a given perception action loop is to permit a functional adaptive behavior to occur. This happens when the effectivities of the organism are placed in the correct relation to the affordances of the task. That relation is implemented by lawful ecological information. This can be seen in two ways. First, it is another way of stating the analysis of lawful ecological information as an impredicative entailment. Second, it can be seen empirically. In the fact that how the effectivity develops over space and time is driven by the spatiotemporal behavior of the lawful ecological informational contact. the organism has with the affordance, and not of the affordance itself. For example, when moving to intercept a fly ball, outfielders move either so as to cancel the optical acceleration or the optical curve of the ball's projectile motion. It is the information, not the ball's projectile dynamics, that directly shape fielders' locomotion paths as they try to intercept a ball. Other examples of this fact come from the work on the prospective control of interception more generally. And also the pattern of stable and unstable coordinated rhythmic movements. The fact that the required relations are implemented by lawful ecological information immediately solves the first two issues with dispositional analysis. First, why do I not climb stairs whenever I am in the presence of stairs? When dispositions come into contact, they must manifest. But I can readily not bring them into contact by not entering into a stair climbing perception action relation. Perhaps I am not looking at the stairs, or I am sitting down. In these last two cases, I am coupled to the environment via sitting or walking related information, not stair climbing information. And so I am not currently in the stair climbing relation. Second, what about overlapping minds? I have to add here, this is a massive problem in quantum mechanics. Two different observers collapsing at the same time. End of my comment. No problem, even when we are both looking at a coffee cup with the intention of grasping it. We must be in a different relation to the cup for the simple fact our points of observation cannot occupy the same location at the same time. The handle may be closer to me than to you. For example, changing which type of grasp is most useful. I need to comment and say here that this is similar to Terry's showing the subjective participation in the fractality makes for objectivity. So the two different points of observation do actually enforce each other rather than nullify or negate each other. End of my comment. The third problem can also potentially be solved with lawful ecological information. And that is the problem of perceptual explanation for representation-hungry problems. This work is newer and very much in development, but it is promising, and it has the advantage that it does not rely on anything with the problems of general ecological information. The details have been laid out so far in Golonka and developed in Golonka Wilson 2019. I will lay out the idea here, but direct the interested reader to the other papers for the full arguments. Law-based versus convention-based use of lawful ecological information. Because of the law-based process that projects world dynamics into array kinematics. all ecological information variables in an array are lawfully specific to some dynamical property. However, not all variables available in a task are specific to the currently task-relevant dynamical property. And interestingly, people do sometimes use these non-specifying variables to judge that property. This result reveals an interesting fact. While all lawful information specify a dynamical property, organisms are not required to use that lawful information as information for that property. This is because information and the property that created it are not the same thing. The information is the kinematic projection of the dynamical property, and only the former is in literal contact with the organism. You could compare here to implicit understanding from the Bohmian paradigm. Explicit is the former one, and that goes to make an understanding available. How can information be different from the thing it depicts, so to speak? End of my quote. The practical upshot of all this is that there is therefore room to learn to use information to mean something other than what it specifies. Golonka characterized the possibilities for using lawful ecological information into two categories: law-based use and convention-based use. The law-based use of lawful ecological information is when an organism uses that variable as perceptual information for the dynamical property that created it. and organizes its behavior with respect to that property. The convention-based use of information is when an organism uses that variable as perceptual information for anything other than the dynamical property that created it. So as to organize its behavior with respect to an evolutionary, experimentally, ecologically, or socioculturally maintained convention, linking the property to something else. The kind of constraints invoked by Breuneberg as general ecological information while not able to work as perceptual information are the kind of constraints that make convention-based use of lawful information an option. The constraints is what gives the knowledge. They are not limitations. They inhabit both sides of the borderline. And actually, constraints is what makes understanding, perception possible. My comment. Law-based use and convention-based use, and here's a quote from Golomka, does not break down clearly along obvious lines such as natural versus human-made, social versus non-social, or linguistic versus non-linguistic. Therefore, it is necessary to take a task-specific approach to deciding whether a behavior is organized with respect to conventional or law-based information. That task-specific approach proceeds as follows. The ecological information available to an organism is created by the lawful projection of task dynamics into array kinematics. Using lawful ecological information in a law-based manner means using a variable as information for the dynamical property that created it. That is, in this example, detecting information created by a beer can and using that information to organize your reaching and grasping behavior so that it complements the beer can's grasping affordances. The law-based use of information can support both action selection, that is coordination, and action control, because the variable is being used as information for the action relevant task property that we need to behave with respect to. So do note here how elegantly we now have two sides, the dynamics and the lawful projection. And we can have both, we need both, and they do not exclude each other. This solution is mimicking the solution of Terry to the spot. For example, law-based use supports both selecting prehension of that beer can as an appropriate action, as well as the online control of that prehension, because it entails using the variable as information for prehension relevant properties of the can. Using information in a convention-based manner means using a variable as information for something other than the dynamical property that created it. Could be things like detecting information created by the beer can and using that information to organize your behavior with respect to the presence of beer. I will just look at it. We have two aspects. We have the dynamical and the law-based, and they usually exclude each other. So philosophically, scientifically, they depart, and one says it's all law-based and the other one says it is all dynamical. This, I would say, millennia-long philosophical problem comes to the resolution in the borderline of the fractal readout. Here, in the Gibsonian take of affordances, it gets a mimicked but another perspective, showing that we can have information of the beer can, but we can still be in dynamical contact with it, grasping it, using it for its purposes, and it doesn't have to be all in the beer can, nor in the observer. It is intertwined, or as Terry says, intermingled. But listen now, it can also be entangled. Yes, please.
I can take the microphone and say something.
Yes.
And also, perhaps, I think it's good. You can look at those three. Do you see me? Yes.
See you indeed.
Say yes. So in this dichotomy between the beer can and the observer, we can. There is a keyword, grasping, that you mentioned earlier. Grasping. Grasping made me think about one thing that the American philosopher George Lakoff said. He made an experiment where people would have describe a person, and these people would have a coffee cup, and in some cases the coffee was hot, in some cases the coffee cup was cold, and when they describe a person, if the coffee cup that they grasped was warm, they would describe the person as warm, and vice versa. So you could say that in this grasping of the coffee cup comes the dissolve the dichotomy between the observer. Since if I have here a coffee cup that I grasp, and somebody would ask me to describe you, for instance, and if you have given me a nice warm cup of coffee, I would describe you extra warmly. But be assured, even if you would give me cold coffee, I would describe you warm still, but not as warm as usual. So I think we have really understood Affordance and George Lakoff, that everything is now coming together. Yes, do you want to add something?
Yes, I will read a little bit from the conclusion, and I will make a segue to the next lecture, where I will show how this helped me with Heidegger as well. It is a marvelous tool that Terry handed us. I could almost call it a magic wand, because it solves mental locks that been haunting me for decades, I'd say. It's very helpful. And I think if you don't have that mechanism or tool, you will be locked in the either or for necessary reasons. There is no escape from that. That shows that this is rather marvelous. I will just take a little from the conclusion and make a smooth segue to the next. In order to be psychologically interesting, affordances must be perceptible. In order to be perceptible, they must come into perceptional, informational contact with an organism. ecological information must take the form of specifying structures in the relatively low energy media that are ambient to the organism, because these are the only things that fill the literal gap between the organism and its task environment. This can be compared to observer observed and inner and outer. And that do so in a way that supports direct perception of affordances. So you see here, you can still eat the cake and keep it. That would not be possible otherwise. You can have information of the beer can and still grasp it. You have the dynamical properties and the lawful properties. Instead, it is merely a regularity between dynamical properties and not between those properties and an organism. It therefore cannot be informative to an organism, and we therefore cannot perceive affordances as relations that rely on it. Affordances as relations are a seductive idea because they seem to offer a solution to the big question of how we are able to organize our behavior with respect to things other than the physical properties of objects in our immediate surroundings. And here I need to put in a parenthesis. This is exactly the point between Vorhanden and Zuhanden. We have become stuck in Vorhanden in our thinking